Hi, my name is Aaron Lacey, and you are listening to the HigherEdReg Rundown. This edition is thoughts for institutions regarding the significant layoffs at the United States Department of Education. I'm an attorney at Thompson, Coburn, LLP, which is a law firm here in the U.S., more than 400 attorneys, locations all over. And we have a higher education practice, which means we have a group of individuals who spend all or most of our time serving institutions of higher education and have for many, many years. The HigherEdReg Rundown, which is this particular video series, is intended to be less than a webinar, a more short and concise delivery where we talk about a focused topic, which clearly in this case is the U.S. Department of Education layoffs. So let's get right into it. First of all, just a couple of preliminary points. I mean, there's obviously a lot still in motion, things to keep in mind. We do anticipate still an executive order from the White House that is directing either and it could sort of get in three steps. It could be the further reduction of workforce. In addition to that, it could be the movement of core functions outside of the agency, and ultimately it could also potentially be a dismantling and closing of the department. We think the last is unlikely. This administration has acknowledged several times publicly that it would take an act of Congress, that's also been stated widely in the press, to actually dismantle the department. But we could see another executive order directing a further reduction in workforce or the moving of core functions. That having been said, one of the key things we wanted to emphasize at the outset, we've been asked this question by clients multiple times, we are not aware of any political will either in Congress on either side, meaning Republicans or the Democrats, or at the White House to get rid of the student loan and grant programs. To the contrary, there is very strong continuing bipartisan support for those programs, and we've seen repeatedly statements out of the White House that support those programs, particularly the Pell Grant program as used in career and technical education. So it's possible you've got fewer people administering those programs. You could see an effort to move those programs elsewhere, but they're created by Congress, and they seem to continue to have widespread support both by the folks in Congress and up on the Hill. With regard to the reduction in force, which is going to be our discussion, we just again wanted to hit a few preliminary points. First of all, the union that represents many of the employees that were RIF'd has already made clear that they are going to fight this reduction in force, which one would expect. A group of 21 attorney generals has already filed a lawsuit in federal court challenging the department's reduction in force. Also wanted to note there could be rehiring down the road. We've already seen in some cases where the Trump administration has reduced force at other agencies, then determined that it needs folks to come back in order to actually administer critical functions, that it's got to do some rehiring and a willingness to do that. We don't know what scale that would be on, of course, but we just want to highlight, there's sort of this effort to dismiss all these folks. There are these critical functions that have to be maintained, and there could be some effort to rehire folks if there's a determination that more hands on deck are needed. And finally, we also wanted to note just in the last 24 hours, today is March 14th, Friday, when we're recording. In the last 24 hours, there have been a couple of federal judges that have said that the firing at multiple agencies of probationary employees violated the law and has directed the White House to rehire those probationary employees. That doesn't include the U.S. Department of Education, but we just included this data point because it evidences, that a lot of these efforts to reduce force across the federal government are continuing to be litigated in court, and certainly this reduction in force that is impacting the department, in addition to the AG lawsuits, we could see other litigation forthcoming. So let's talk first about the scope of the RIF and what we know about it. We want to make sure to share that with you, and then we're going to give just a handful. We're going to talk a little bit about how we are thinking about it, and then specifically some suggestions for institutions, because we're going to assume, even with the litigation, even with potential rehirings, all those things, that you are going to see a reduced workforce at the department over the, now and over the coming months. So first of all, with regard to the RIF, we start with the U.S. Department of Education's own newsroom. If you aren't checking out that, we suggest you put it on your favorites tab. That's where the department puts out its own press releases. Obviously, this is the view of the department and the agency, but it's still a good place to start if you're trying to find out what's going on. So according to the department's newsroom, the department workforce has been reduced from about 4,130 when around the time of the inauguration to about 2,100 280, and that is inclusive not only of the reduction in force that we saw this week, but also you had 259 employees the department reported accepted a deferred resignation program, which was sort of the buyout, and then another 313 accepted a voluntary separation incentive payment concept that OPM also made available. But that means, by our math, that you had about 1,300 that would have been notified on March 11th that they were part of the RIF. According to the department, again, employees impacted by the RIF will be placed on administrative leave for about a week from today. Again, I mentioned this is the 14th when we're recording, so that would be next Friday, March 21st, is when those folks are expected to go on administrative leave. They're supposed to receive full pay and benefits through June 9th, and severance or retirement benefits in accordance with their length of service, collective bargaining agreements, and federal law. We know that as of Wednesday of this week, so a couple of days ago, at least some, if not many, of the employees that were part of the RIF were already unable to access systems to send external emails. Our understanding is there was some ability to correspond or communicate internally with one another. The Education Reform Now, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit think tank in Washington, D.C., obtained a list of the union employees who were part of the RIF. So this is about 969 individuals out of that 1,300, and then they made certain de-identified data sets available. So they didn't name those employees, but they did put a data set out that lists all the persons without their names, but sort of by position and department. And then they analyzed the data and put out 2 or 3 charts, which was extremely helpful in understanding sort of the nature of the RIFs and who was actually impacted at the department, the different divisions within the department that were impacted. By the way, the live links in this presentation, you can see there are links on the slides. You can click those to get to the underlying data sets. We will make sure that these slides are available in a blog post, and then at the end of this presentation, I'll show you a QR code you can go to get to that blog post and find the hard slides, so you can download a PDF and get to the link. Okay, so the data in the charts appears to confirm widespread reports. We've had conversations with folks at the department and elsewhere. We've heard from various institutions that have had conversations with folks at the department. And this data seems to confirm the understanding that FSA, meaning Federal Student Aid, and the Office of Civil Rights, OCR, experienced the deepest cuts, followed by the Institute of Educational Sciences. So here's the first chart that EARN made available based on the data set of union employees who were impacted. And you can see here, Federal Student Aid, I think it's actually here for you. Federal Student Aid, about 326 individuals terminated in that department. Office for Civil Rights close behind at 243, Institute of Educational Sciences at 105, and then as you go down the list, you see smaller numbers of individuals terminated in those different departments. This is another really interesting chart. So EARN took that same data, they took the actual numbers of individuals who were terminated and then compared that to the number of full-time employees in those different departments as of 2024. So it gives you a sense as to what percentage of those departments were impacted overall. Again, this is just based on the union employee data set, not the full 1,300. You can see Federal Student Aid, though it lost the largest number of individuals, has, as a percentage, it looks to be about 20% in that range. So you're talking about 320 and change out of about 1,600. But the Office of Civil Rights, you'll note in Institute of Educational Sciences, while they had fewer in terms of actual numbers, much more significant in terms of percentage of the individuals who were actually in those departments. EARN did another interesting analysis. I think this one's a little harder to, if I'm EARN, do in a meaningful way, just meaning that not everybody fits neatly into one of these buckets at the department. But it does give you some sense. You'll see by position. So they noted of the union employees who were fired, they considered 213 of those across all departments to be attorneys. Most of those are going to be at the Office of Civil Rights. And then you see the next couple of 3 categories of employee, which, again, you got people with different titles who are sort of being scooped into these categories, but management and program analyst, information technology, institutional review specialists. So a lot of those folks will be in different areas, but many of them will be in Federal Student Aid, particularly your institutional review specialist. So another really helpful data point that was obtained and released, Politico obtained an EdOrg chart. So this was presumably an internal document the U.S. Department of Education was using. It was dated March 11th. And if you go through, it's 20, 30 pages long, but it has all the different, from an organizational standpoint, all the different departments within Ed. And it shows where there are, presumably, this is what we understand to be the case, where there are organizational units that are highlighted. I'll call this color red, highlighted red. That means that they were experiencing reductions in force. Now, it's not clear from the org chart, does that mean one person in that unit? Does that mean everyone in that unit? But it still gives you some sense organizationally as to which elements of the department had no impact whatsoever and which elements had a significant impact. And here you can see this is the page from the chart that shows federal student aid and a number of the case teams right here in the middle. If you click on that link again on this slide, if you download a PDF, click on that link, you can bring up this chart and work through it. The key point I want to make is the Politico chart, along with the earned data, and also based on the many conversations we've had with folks at client institutions and also in some cases at the department, all appears to confirm reports that but for Chicago and Philadelphia, all the federal student aid case teams were largely RIF'd, meaning almost everybody in those case teams around the country. That's our current understanding. So that would mean the case teams located in Atlanta, Dallas, Kansas City, the New York, Boston case team, San Francisco, Seattle case team, and the multi-region and foreign school case team in Washington, D.C. And I'm going to talk about why that's so significant for institutions on the next slide, but I do want to also note in recent years, the department has been creating sort of specialty units within federal student aid that were housed in certain of these case teams, and it appears to us right now that the individuals who were part of those specialty units within those case teams also were part of the RIF. So you're talking about the financial services group down in Atlanta, the third-party servicer group that was housed in Kansas City, and the critical response division that was housed down in Dallas. So why am I focused on federal student aid? Certainly, Office of Civil Rights has important functions that it carries out, as well as those various units within FSA that deal with education, statistics, information, and research. But we work with institutions of higher education on a daily basis, and our impression is, or our sort of belief is, that most of what you are trying to accomplish as institutions, if you have strategic initiatives, if you have changes you need to report, if you're thinking about a merger, if you're adding new programs or locations, many of those things that you want to do, if you submitted your financials and you're thinking about your composite score and you want to talk to someone about that, federal student aid and the case teams historically have carried out most of those functions. So a lot of the things that, when you talk about like what is the impact immediately on institutions of these reductions in force, the loss of the case teams means that many of the individuals who were carrying out those functions, who were processing electronic applications, are no longer there. And so we think it's going to be with reductions in federal student aid, and particularly the case teams, that institutions are going to feel most immediately, and that you're going to have to figure out how to work around and manage if you want to continue to move your processes forward, right? Office of Civil Rights, for example, most of the time when an institution's hearing from OCR, it's because there's a complaint or another issue, and they're investigating you. So if that's put on pause, that doesn't necessarily impact your ability to do other things that you're out, trying to do with regard to strategic planning, et cetera. Just to recap, when we're talking about federal student aid, I mentioned some of the things they do, but they put out the training and information, and in particular, those case teams, policy guidance, technical assistance, meaning like with the EAP or G5 or a lot of those kinds of things. Although to be clear, there are individuals at G5 who are apart from the case teams who manage a lot of those questions. But some of those types of nuts and bolts processing questions, certainly questions around EAPs and sort of how your regulatory approvals work, all that would be out of FSA and the case teams in particular. Certification and recertification, review of annual audit submissions was that financial group down in Atlanta, changes in ownership and control. If you have questions about who is a third-party servicer and reporting that would have been the third-party servicer group in Kansas City you'd probably reach out to. And then a lot of different kinds of reviews, including in particular Title IV program reviews, are carried out by FSA. So if you're in the middle of one of those processes, the folks who conducted that program review, who are working on your program review report or reviewing your response, may no longer be at the agency. So, taking a deep breath, here's how we're trying to contextualize and think about these reductions. And when we think about like what's this going to mean for institutions today and over the next 2 or 3 or 4 months and potentially 6 months or 12 months from now. Um, this agency right now, the current Department of Ed, really has two sort of things. I mean, they have a lot of concepts in play, but with regard to this issue, there's sort of two vectors here that we're focused on. One is the size of the workforce, and the agency obviously is focused on reducing the size of the workforce. But they are also focused on reducing the scope of responsibility and the complexity of processes at the department. They've talked a lot about that. You talk about eliminating potentially gainful employment, simplifying bar defense, simplifying the financial responsibility reporting framework, eliminating a lot of what's been built out around change in ownership over the last 3 or 4 years. So that is also a real focus of this agency. In our mind, and if you look here on the chart, number one probably represents where we were under the Biden administration, right? So you'd had sort of a flat line in terms of Ed staff. There hadn't been a significant increase or decrease in the number of folks over at the department, but you had this enormous increase in responsibility with the rolling out of all these regulations and all of these rulemakings. And you had the rollout of the EAP, which had a lot of problems, and the FAFSA issues. And so you had an enormous amount of increased responsibility. You had processes that became more complex, and you had no additional hands on deck. And the consequence was, I think most of us who deal with the department on a daily basis felt like there was enormous resource constraint at the department already during the prior administration. It was already difficult to get things done. Program reviews were taking 2 or 3 years, changes in ownership, 2 or 3 years to approve. Lots of processes had been delayed. And again, we think that's because while the workforce kind of remained flat, you had this tremendous increase in scope of responsibility and complexity of processes. So you were below this point of efficiency where, if these two things are sort of in harmony, you would think that things would be run theoretically in an efficient way. We've just had this massive reduction in force, and there's been no change as of yet, really, to, again, scope of responsibility, complexity of processes. So in our mind, we sort of moved from number one on this chart down to number two. And that's where we are right now, which is obviously not great. In theory, if the current administration does what they suggest they are going to do, we would hope that over the coming months, we start to see electronic announcements, dear colleagues, rulemakings rolled out, and that scope of responsibility, complexity idea, it begins to be reduced. And as that occurs, you will need, hopefully, this is the idea, fewer people to carry out those functions. So you would move towards the point of efficiency, and that might get us to number three. Or in 6 months or 12 months, it could theoretically get to number four. Many might watch this and say, Aaron, that's wishful thinking, that's Pollyannish. I don't know, but that's the notion, is that at some point, if this agency is able to reduce scope of responsibility, functions and processes, and simplify, you might theoretically get to a point where functions can be carried out as efficiently as they were being managed, at least under the prior administration, if not more efficiently. The other thing I want to highlight is, we readily acknowledge this might be different for different types of functions. So for example, what I mean by that, it may be that there are certain functions that already are pretty easy to carry out, and the department only needs 2 or 3 weeks to handle them, and they're just in high volume, and it just takes a certain number of people to press those buttons and get them done. So there might not be that much opportunity to make those processes more efficient. You just have to have a certain number of hands on deck, right? And that could be the things that are actually pretty simple to push forward, like an update to a program or an update to a president or a chief financial officer. Just by, I'm speculating. But there are other processes, and folks know who work with our practice, we do a lot of merger and acquisition work in the higher education space. And that process has become enormously complex over the last 3 or 4 years as compared to what it looked like 10 or 15 years ago. There's a lot of opportunity there to simplify that process. So if you have a unit within the department that manages those functions, it's been reduced from 10 people to 2 people, but you also take that process and you simplify it dramatically, it might be that those 2 people could carry out that process more efficiently than it was being carried out previously. What is certain, though, is that it is going to take time, months from today, for that reduction in complexity to occur. So there's going to be some period here, even in the best of circumstances, where we think there are going to be delays, of course, and the dust is going to have to settle. So let's get real practical. What do you do in the interim over the next 4, 5, or 6 months? What if you've got certain types of things in play? Obviously, we don't have all the answers, but we've been thoughtful about what are some things institutions could be doing today to try to be constructive. So first of all, we would ensure that all personnel who get communications from the department are on heightened alert to be watching for anything coming from the agency, right? So this is not just your financial aid folks. It could be your president, CEO, your CFO. The department has the emails and contact information for a lot of people at your institution. And the notion is this agency might be communicating to you, on a go-forward basis, you were working with person A, now you're going to be working with person B. Or they might just have a broad communication that says, if you need to make a certain type of required notice to the department, this is the new email that you need to use. You obviously want to make sure that you're not missing those communications. So I would talk with the folks who have access. Some of your financial aid folks have access to certain mailboxes that are located on portals that they can go check to see if their communication's coming down. Somebody needs to be signed up to make sure that when Partner Connect, which is part of the department system, is, when new electronic announcements or dear colleagues come out, that those are getting to the right people and they're being reviewed. And then, of course, they need to be watching in their own emails if you want to check with your IT to make sure that, there are no firewalls or anything that would block these communications. But we think kicking the tires on all of those types of things is important to make sure that to the extent there are communications that you receive, you're getting them and you know who the new contact or what the new process would be. Identify and prioritize any circumstance where feedback or approval is required from the department or submission is due to the department by a fixed deadline. What do we mean by that? So we have a client, for example, that was having an issue with the department, and the department sent them a letter, and they said by June 30 of 2025, if this issue is not resolved, then you have to post a letter of credit. So they have a written communication from the department that gives them a firm deadline and says there's a consequence if this issue is not resolved by that deadline. So they've been working with individuals at the department to reach a resolution, and we think most of those individuals aren't there anymore. So now this institution has got to figure out quickly, who do we get to so that we can resolve this issue before this deadline hits, right? So if it's very important that you distinguish right now between types of circumstances or issues where you may need or require feedback from the department to resolve a matter because you've already got a deadline or consequence that you're running up against, versus things that theoretically could sit for a period of months without any harm to the institution. For example, and this is the third bullet, if you've got program reviews, audits, investigations, certifications or recertifications, and other processes that are underway, but if they are put on pause, will not harm the institution, meaning, there's not a liability hanging out there you've been asked to pay, there's no interruption to your Title IV, anything like that, then we would suggest trying to be patient. And part of that is because, for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, you may have one or two shots to get to the people who remain at the department. I mean, our view is when you talk about the case teams and the individuals who are interfacing with institutions, we may be down 80%. Right? So you've got, 20% staff remaining that's now going to be trying to field all of these issues. If you have one opportunity to get to them, you want to make sure, obviously, that you're talking about the most important thing. So you may want to talk to other folks in your organization, if you're a large organization, who may be trying to get, less important things through the department. And you may want to say, let's talk about the range of things that we're dealing with vis-a-vis the department right now. And let's make sure that we are strategic in where we are pushing to get, in front of the folks who remain and get things resolved, and that we're not using up our, sort of political chips or regulatory chips, so to speak, on things that really aren't that pressing. We would assume that all pending policy inquiries to individual FSA staff, for example, are not going to be successfully transitioned. I mean, maybe they will be, but I really fear it may be wishful thinking to assume that the department, if you've been emailing an individual institutional reviewer at a case team, right, who's no longer there, asking a question, and I would not assume that someone in the department is going to find that email, successfully transition it to a new staff member, and they're going to get back to you. Actually, what we would assume, I hope I'm wrong, but what we would assume is that that's not going to happen, and that you should make a plan to identify a new person at the department and probably reinitiate that policy discussion. Understand and distinguish among actions that require only notice and actions that require approval. It may be that you've not really considered this in the past, because if your feeling was we've got some strategic initiative underway, we put in for an approval to the department, and the department, if they usually take 3 to 4 months to get back to us, and that's plenty of time given our timeline. You don't even give much consideration as to whether or not you may have to have that approval before you could move forward on your strategic initiative. But as it turns out, it is often the case some departmental functions only require notice. For example, if you have mentioned earlier a new president or CEO, you have an obligation to notify the department, but you don't have to wait for them to somehow approve that before you would employ that person, right? It's just an update to the department that you're required to provide within a certain time frame. Similarly, institutions that are in good standing with the department, meaning you're on a regular program participation agreement, you've got no other types of restrictions, your composite score is above 1.5, all those kinds of things, you can roll out new programs, and you can even establish a new branch campus and fund Title IV. You have to notify the department, but you don't have to wait for approval from the department before you actually start that funding. Now, by the way, if you're thinking about this, consult your counsel, consult your compliance folks, make 100% sure that you are eligible to do this, right? Because not every institution can, it's called self-certifying. Everybody's not eligible to self-certify. Again, if you're on provisional approval, if you've got other conditions. So please don't say Aaron said we could do this. You need to check with folks about your specific circumstances. But the idea is it's very important for you to know if you're planning about strategic initiatives, if you're thinking about new programs or new campuses or other functions, whether or not you can initiate those initiatives, right, with just notice to the department and not, you don't have to wait for approval to come back. So make sure you're paying attention to that distinction, because you can see clearly how it could impact the timing of your ability to get those things rolled out. Consider timing strategic initiatives so that critical interactions with the department will occur in 6 to 12 months. So, for example, if you're someone who's just completed a change in ownership, or you're about to complete a change in ownership or a merger, there's nothing you can do about that. You're just going to have to work with your counsel and advisors to find people at the department to make sure you can get those notices in. But let's say you're just starting this process. So right now you're talking with a potential partner about a merger. If you could time it so that event is completed in 6 months or 12 months, now acknowledging there could be further disruption at the department, but let's just say for a second that this is the primary reduction in force. And keeping in mind, this administration clearly has its priorities around reducing policies and complexities. If you can give it 6 to 12 months, it will give the agency time ostensibly to start reducing and simplifying those processes, to transition some of these core responsibilities to remaining staff, et cetera, so that when you close that transaction or complete that strategic initiative, some of this dust has settled and you'll have a better idea about how to carry it out. I mentioned earlier, just a couple of final thoughts again, that you've got the union that's vowed to fight, and there is litigation out there. So just keep apprised of what's going on, acknowledging that a lot of this could change. This is our higher education resources page. If you will scan this QR code, I think it's right here for you, or no, actually it's right there. If you'll scan the QR code, it will take you to the education resources page, and then you can go to where it's any of these, all our compliance resources, all our webinars, everything is there. But if you go down to blog posts, open that, you'll see the most recent blog post will talk about this video and have the slides, so you can download the slides, and if you want to, click on the links. We know this is an extremely challenging time for higher education and for institutions, and we wish you the best. If we can be of assistance, obviously don't hesitate to reach out to us. And with all that having been said, until next time, be well.